Excellent, good. Well, welcome to this last session of the day. My name is Jeff Poulin, and I am the Arts Education Program Manager at Americans for the Arts. Thank you so much for being here. Oh, there's one more session today. Excuse me. I apologize. It is my last session today. But before we get started, we do have a few announcements to make. This session is called Radically Disrupting the Community Cultural Planning Engine. There are 3 learning outcomes that I'd like to review with you now. We hope to learn about the integration of longitudinal and incremental evaluation and market research to measure cultural vitality and impact. We want to see what happens when you place art and artists at the center of a cultural planning process, and how. And we want to hear about how certain communities are pushing beyond cultural plans to integrate arts and culture in full community plans in new and innovative ways. Also, a reminder, Americans for the Arts has several policies related to accessibility, which is part of our ongoing work to pursue cultural equity. First, we at Americans for the Arts believe that amplification benefits everyone, and that no one should need to request that someone use a microphone in order to understand effectively. As such, we've instituted a policy that anyone who is saying something that isn't meant to be heard by the entire room must use a microphone, and we have one here. In that same vein, please refrain from any side conversations, as they are disruptive to your fellow attendees and can keep them from fully hearing session content. With that, thank you for attending annual convention, and I will turn it over to our session moderator.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks for being here. Great turnout for the almost last session of the day. We decided to forego the comfortable chairs, just not feeling comfortable sitting up on that stage. Anyway, my name is Tom Borup, and I'm going to introduce our other presenters, and I have a presentation, and then in this order. Leslie Elwood, I'm just going to read a little bit from their bios to get us going, but Leslie Elwood is the president and founder of Elwood Associates. She contracts with public institutions and with developers, including the City of Los Angeles Office of Cultural Affairs and many transit projects and a lot of other cities. And part of her focus is brokering partnerships between developers and nonprofit and community groups. And she is going to present on a project in California in tag team with Mario Mesquita, who is the education manager working with the San Diego Museum of Contemporary Art. He has an MFA in public practice from Otis College of Art in California, and is a founding member of Michelada Think Tank, a group of socially conscious artists, educators, activists, and others. And then Carla Raines is the CEO and principal of Corona Insights, a strategic planning firm here in Denver. She worked on Imagine 2020, the Denver cultural plan, and she sees herself as an associative thinker, adept at creating breakthrough ideas. So, and I'm Tom Borup. I hail from Minneapolis, and I'm a cultural planner and cultural district planner. I focus on the intersection between urban planning and cultural planning and the arts. And I also teach and lead a master's degree program at the University of Minnesota in arts and cultural leadership, and teach cultural planning for Drexel University. So that's the lineup. I'm going to go up. We still have to go up here. Okay, I'm not? Okay. I'm such a Mac person. There we go. So I'm going to talk about two different things in this presentation. The first thing, and I thought it was appropriate at the beginning, is to think a little bit about what are we disrupting? We're talking about disrupting something, but let's take a look for a few minutes at what it is we're disrupting. And I need the clicker. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is 4 really quick examples of I'm not sure if they're disruptive or not, but practices that I've used in my cultural planning work in 4 different cities. So I started a couple of years ago thinking about writing a book on cultural planning, and one of the questions that came to me based on my experience is cultural planning leading communities into sort of their future, their dynamic, new cultural experiences, or is it holding them back? Is cultural planning, in some cases, perhaps excluding diverse forms of expression, whether intentional or not? And is it narrowing its full impact, the full possibilities that it can have on communities? I did this presentation in Germany a few months ago, and I realized, oh, circling the wagons. They might not know what that reference means. But when they saw the picture, they got it. So I launched a small research project with the help of Americans for the Arts. Believe it or not, there's been no research on cultural planning in the US in terms of what's the status of this field and this practice since 1994, when Craig Driesen did a really wonderful study, which unfortunately was never published. So working with Craig and devising a series of questions, many of which mirror his questions, we were able to get some trajectory of progress or lack of progress, in some cases, in the field. And I'm only going to be able to skim the surface of a few elements of that study here. It would take an hour presentation to get through all of it. So one of the big questions that comes up, and in the literature on cultural planning, there's a lot of wonderful stuff from Australia, some from Canada, and the UK. One of the big questions is, how is culture defined? When you do cultural planning, what are you talking about? And in many cases, and a lot of the researchers in other parts of the world say that culture is often confused with elitist notions of art. Therefore, it's leaving most people off the table. So, is that the case or not in the US? What I did was offered a long series of items that the respondents to the survey, there were 50 cities around the country who responded to the complete survey, to see what they included or perhaps didn't include in their cultural plans. So you can see here, I'm not going to read all these, but these are kind of the normal things that you might think of in cultural plans. And then also in the top third, start to get into organizations serving ethnic communities, neighborhood festivals, and educational entities, oddly, all the way down to 66%. And then still in the top half, we have text over some of it, but you can see civic engagement, other kinds of public celebrations, neighborhood things, for-profits that are part of the creative economy. Those start to come in to the picture just above 50%. And the bottom one there that you can hardly see is recreational, outdoor, and environmental activities and organizations, just at 50%. That, in some communities, outdoors is really important, in others, less so. But in the bottom, the things that fell to the bottom, at the very bottom, culinary arts and local food growing and producing, and the for-profit businesses that are involved in importing creative products into communities. So, unfortunately, Craig Driesen did not do his study the same way in that question. So there's no direct comparison, but based on the ways that Craig described how culture was dealt with in those plans that he looked at from the 1980s and early 90s, and from other international literature on cultural planning, I think there has been some expansion in the definition. However, if you look at other resources, LaPlaca Cohen and their Culture Track study, they have food and drink experiences a little bit higher. However, you see opera, ballet, classical music, kind of in the 50% or below range for what the general public considers culture. So this, you could say, the cultural planning sector, the local arts agency sector, is a little bit behind the curve in terms of where the general public thinks of as what is culture. So also in the study, and I just pulled this item out because I'm a planner who really loves process, and I believe that process, if done well, is really, really important part of the planning. 80% said that they thought the process, and we define process as the ways in which people in the community are involved in the planning activities. 80% said the process made a really positive difference. So I was happy to see that item. So in terms of outcomes, near the front end of the survey, we asked communities what did they expect to get from their cultural plans. And then towards the end of the survey, asked them, what did you get from plan? And we used the same language, just worded in future tense and past tense. And Craig did something similar, so we had a lot of things to compare directly from his study and the one I just finished. In 1994, the top 3 outcomes, and this is not empirical data in terms of outcomes, this is just what the local arts agencies said they thought the outcomes were. But it's reliable, especially when compared 23 years apart, gives a really interesting trajectory. So the top 3 outcomes: finding new financial resources, bolstering education, youth development, and new cultural facility development. In 2017, the top 4 outcomes: building connections within the cultural sector, learning new ways to add value to community, better organizing the sector for advocacy, and for greater impact. And those were much lower in Craig's in 1994 in his study. In fact, the lowest, sadly, the lowest of all outcomes in 2017 was allocation of more resources to underrepresented communities. There was about 70% said that they hoped that would happen, and about 30% said that happened on greater or lesser extent, and in only one case was it a greater extent than what had been offered to those communities in the past. So in other also actions to address equity, diversity, inclusion, barriers to participation, and youth development, those were also in the lower areas of outcomes. So it's kind of it's not really a optimistic commentary, and those really hadn't changed since 1994. So while the planning is aspirational, it's not meeting, as a result of the planning and later on in the work, it's not meeting those expectations that people have for it. So there's something in the implementation, getting over that hump between saying we want to do this and actually being able to do it. And I think we've heard a lot at this conference about what some of those obstacles and barriers are. So now I'm going to switch and run through these really quickly, these sort of 4 ways that I've tried to disrupt. I didn't use that word, disrupt, when I was doing it, but since Americans for the Arts wanted to title the session that, I'm using that. So the first, and this is the definition that I try to use in communities in terms of doing cultural planning, is ways of living together. Pretty broad, pretty anthropological, but one really wonderful experience with that was in Lawrence, Kansas, which is this incredibly progressive little blue bubble in this incredibly red state. And these are the things that shook out as the 6 major categories in the cultural plan for Lawrence. And this flips the findings about what culture is upside down, because discovering the local, including food and also beer, art and services was number 1, the thing that they wanted to achieve. Embracing all, the diversity, was the second major item. Building places together, having participatory planning. They had some negative experiences there in terms of community involvement in the city planning. and that came up really high on what they wanted to do in the future. Building a creative identity, promoting lifelong learning, and walkable, kid-friendly neighborhoods. Those are not the things you usually see in cultural plans, but the folks in Lawrence, that's what they wanted for their community, under that ways of living together idea. So, secondly, is starting from broad community concerns, rather than starting from what are the needs of the arts community, what's the needs of the whole community. And we had a wonderful opportunity, Christine Harris and I, to work with the regional, Des Moines regional organization called Bravo, and they have a wonderful website. If you Google Bravo, Greater Des Moines, or whatever words will get you to it. They started by saying, we want to identify opportunities to leverage arts and culture as essential drivers of the quality of life and economic development. And that was, they brought us in to help figure out how to do that. And this is not all that Bravo does, but this was a big new initiative that they wanted to launch, which they have launched. I just talked to Sally Dix yesterday, and she was thrilled with the things that they had gotten started. So we started with the community priorities. And we looked around a lot. It took us a little while, but we decided to borrow from this regional plan that had recently been finished, Capital Crossroads, and their 8 top catalytic priorities, which, as you can see, it's everywhere from downtown vitality to good business climate, user-friendly transportation system, different housing types and costs. The very bottom one is about water quality and soil health. These are the things in central Des Moines that are important. So, how could arts and culture contribute to those community priorities? So we did some work around existing activities, and we did surveys and focus groups using Americans for the Arts typology of community development activities so that we had data to compare from Des Moines as well as what Americans for the Arts finds. And so we found where the existing cultural activities were happening, and then we developed a set of criteria with working with this steering committee of local community leaders. And these are the criteria that they came up with. It's basically about where's there already traction, where are the greatest chances of success and impact, and with partnerships and so on. And so we identified the opportunities through that process. And they were in 4 areas. One is, they called it Everyday, Everywhere Art. It's a bit of creative placemaking and public art, but it addresses a number of the regional priorities. Same with number 2, strengthening the creative economy, business climate, workforce development, youth, cultural tapestries, all about diversity and inclusion, and youth connections is the 4th. And so there's initiatives that they have designed and launched under each one of these areas. And they've already launched a number of them and have gotten a great response in the community. So just 2 last things really quickly. Building on local assets as a place to start. And the example I want to use is Duluth, Minnesota. And what Duluth is somewhat of a Rust Belt city, shipping port, older industrial. What do they have? They have people who know how to make stuff. They have people who know how to ship things. So building on, these are the 4 priorities in the Duluth Cultural Plan. Cultivating a creative workforce and building on their maker economy, activating, connecting their neighborhoods and towns. They have 26 miles of lakefront. It's like a 1 mile wide and 26 mile long city. It's really, if you can imagine the difficulties in having a sense of connection between neighborhoods, it's a big one there. Cultural tourism, they have that wonderful lake, 26 miles of it. And they wanted to understand more about the creative sector and its impacts. That's one of the ones you can't read. And infrastructure for the creative sector, which they really didn't have. And that's, the last one is a fairly typical in a cultural plan. And finally, leading cultural planning from outside arts agencies. So that doesn't happen a lot, but sometimes. And I worked a couple years ago in Durango, Colorado, with the planning department. They were updating their comprehensive plan, and they wanted, for the first time, to have a cultural element in their comprehensive plan. So I worked side by side with an urban planning consultant and with the city staff. This was an interesting situation, and comes back around to the culture discussion at the beginning of my presentation, because the default position of what culture is, the sort of elitist notions of art, everybody in the city, everybody, people in the community, it's like the whole idea that Lawrence, Kansas really got about ways of living together did not really take root in Durango. And culture, they decided to name their plan the creative economy. They wanted to really focus on creative economy, which was good because it got outside the box a little bit, but it was a very interesting experience to be talking, even with people of color in the community, talk about culture and the arts, and they immediately think about elitist notions of art. And it's like, oh my God. So a lot of work we have to do there, if that is the goal, is to really broaden and ultimately to be more inclusive and get more resources to previously underrepresented groups, because it's just not happening, as the research says. So anyway, I don't know how long I went, probably a little long, but that's my presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Leslie Elwood, and I'm here with artist Mario Mesquita, who we worked together on a project in Santa Monica. I'm going to be talking a little bit about a case study project that I worked on with an organization called Arts Connection, and so I kind of want to give a shout out to Jennifer Kane. Are you here, Jennifer? No? Is she here? Oh, there she is. Yay, Jennifer. And my partner, Gail Goldman, who I've been working with a lot lately. Mario and I are going to tag team a little bit. I'm going to talk first about just some general concepts about engaging artists and arts organizations in planning projects. And then I'm going to turn it over to Mario, and he's going to speak very specifically about the project that we worked together on in Santa Monica. So I just wanted to restate a couple of the learning outcomes that we are addressing today in our presentations that I think the moderator at the top of the hour talked about. So one of the things I think that kind of relates to what Tom was talking about is this idea of, redefining art as infrastructure, like really taking it out of the typical arts organizations or the individual artists even working in residencies, to think more about how artists are part of a planning process. And today we're gonna look at some project examples, discuss data collection and diversity, and collaboration and partnerships. Because one thing that I think is really important from my end is that, I never do any of this stuff on my own. There's a huge number of people that are always involved, and it really means that there needs to be a spirit of collaboration whenever you're doing a project. So why work with art? I think this is a question maybe not the people in this room ask themselves, but when you're talking to planners or transportation people or economics people or people who are outside of the sort of bubble of our world, they don't always get it. And so I think part of the thing that also relates very much to what Tom was talking about is that often artists bring these incredible resources to the table. They're tied to all of these different types of community organizations, initiatives that are happening in the community, things that have to do, and they have a bunch of skills that they bring to the table, like community engagement, creating processes for acknowledging the importance of a place, historic preservation. So I think one of the things that I have found most rewarding in my practice is that, when I bring an artist to the table, they usually bring with them like a volume of experience and wealth of information, and also network that they've established. So this is actually a slide from Arts Connection, and it's a little bit more, I think, as I have been working on some master plans with Gail Goldman, what we have committed to is really bringing an artist in onto the team for this sort of participatory planning. And in this particular slide, the artist put together a series of items on the table, and the person was, people were brought in for the community, and they picked an item for the table, and they told a story of how they related to that item. And in most cases, it related back to a memory or an idea about their community. And this really started the dialogue of communication and conversation between the artist and the public. So I think there are really a few building blocks that you need to have in order to establish a really successful project. This is a short presentation on a project that I'm currently working out in the Morongo Basin. If you're not familiar with the Morongo Basin, it's out in the area near Joshua Tree. They have one central highway, which is a national park. They have one central highway which goes through 3 cities. It's in the county of San Bernardino. They have very poor infrastructure from the standpoint of biking and pedestrian lanes, and they've had a huge number of traffic fatalities. And so, I am working on, I was brought into this project through my connection with Arts Connection, and the primary planning team is KOA Corporation. So basically their goal of the project was really to connect in a safe way this idea of active transportation. They have plenty of infrastructure to support vehicular traffic, but really not the appropriate infrastructure to support active transportation, which is biking and pedestrians and walkers, and it's also out in a desert area, so it's not really the most hospitable environment. And so this kind of gives you an idea of the borders of the project area. So the planning team, and I really have to credit Arts Connection in their dogged how could I say this? Their dogged representation that artists and the arts could be a very important aspect of this plan. And so what they actually did is they lobbied the county to make sure that certain teams that came to the table when this RFP was issued included an arts organization. And since they're the best positioned in that area, we did end up with a couple of teams. But the truth about it is that KOA had the very sort of best objectives, and they really wanted to embed public art as part of the overall vision for the active transportation plan. So one of the things that I think was really helpful in Arts Connection coming to the table was that they had a network of existing arts organizations already in the community. So from KOA's perspective, this was a huge network of people and organizations that they could do their outreach to, and this was really helpful to the KOA team because they weren't from the region. And so part of what this allowed us to do was to actually hire a couple of artists who came to the table and did some temporary projects with us as we're developing the plan. The other thing that was really a great asset that Arts Connection brought to the table was their cultural asset map. And this was an initiative that they had been working on for several years. It was a GIS-based map that talked about institutions, historical locations, libraries, cultural destinations. And as we went out into the community, one of the things that I think that it helped us think about was how exactly are we helping people get to these destinations? And in fact, do people know about these destinations? So that was one thing that was really kind of interesting about the process as it has unfolded. As part of we had 2 local artists that we hired for this project. The first artist was Matt Adams, who is a local artist, and he also has done amazing illustrations. He's done work for Mad Magazine. He's in a band. He's kind of a hip and cool guy. and what we loved about his work, we went through an RFQ process to identify 2 artists. And then what we did is we sent Matt out on the Safe Routes to Schools program. And basically what he did was he went out with the KOA team and visited with various schools in the area and talked about what are some of the issues that are related to promoting safety to and from school, because they have very little infrastructure there. And these are just some of the more recent images that he's come up with. I wanted to give you guys the opportunity to download his zine, which should be live next week. I put some postcards over here on the table if you would like to take one. But, I think this, again, sort of showed the KOA team that there was a more creative process for a local artist to be involved in developing these sort of safety tips, which really need to be promoted in the community. And it wasn't just the idea of promoting it to the students, but also promoting it to the parents. And I just have to say, I love the illustration on the left, because it's like zine, this sort of very, different type of art form, yet it's referring to like a Nietzsche quote. So it's just this combination of the sort of, zine art and very high art, literature. And this is a list of basically all the partners that were engaged in this project. Aside from the KOE team, myself, and the artists, these were all the different agencies and entities that needed to be involved in order to create what is, a relatively small plan for a relatively small area. Now what I'd like to do is introduce Mario Mesquita. In 2016, my partner Gail Goldman and I started a public art master plan for the city of Santa Monica. And as part of that plan, we told the city we thought it would be a great idea to bring an artist in and have the artist join the team and help us with outreach. And I think one of the things that a lot of us who have done public art plans or cultural plans find is that, the standard planning activities of community meetings and online surveys really just do not reach who you're trying to find. And to get, and so this was really true specifically as it is with other cities in Santa Monica. On the online survey, we received like 202 responses, predominantly white, predominantly over the age of 45. Whereas with Mario had 542 responses because he took his teams out into the community, and he had a much more diverse ethnic and age representation of people within Santa Monica. So with that, I just want to say also that we picked Mario in part because he had a social practice experience. And I think that his ability to sort of envision how the team could be assembled and the types of issues that really needed to be addressed in the way that it was presented to the public was stellar. And I really want to commend Mario, and he knows I hold him dearly, and I feel great appreciation for all he did for us. But I think that one of the challenges, this is not a task that every artist or even arts organization is up for, and that as administrators, we really have to make sure that the fit is right. And part of that really comes from, as I mentioned previously, establishing very clearly what the goals are, and working with the artists to make sure that those goals are met. Because in the end, that information data has to feed into the report. So with that, I'm going to introduce my colleague and friend, Mario Mesquita.
Actually, it was the same slideshow. There we go. So once again, I'm Mario Mesquita. I'm an educator, artist, advocate, and organizer. And the reason why I wanted to highlight that up here is because that's exactly how I go into my practice when I create art. One of the other things that I do is I'm the education manager at the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego. So, I always like to highlight that sometimes the job of an artist is not to be in the spotlight. Sometimes the job of an artist is to actually raise people's voices, to create a space for them to create, and then hone the spotlight onto them. And so that is exactly what I do at the Museum of Contemporary Art through my programs that I manage as well. I also do that in many of my projects, which is why I wanted to share that to better frame what Paletas Santa Monica was all about. This is a brief project that I was able to do in Phoenix, Arizona, where I was working with youth whose parents are from mixed citizens background. Some of their parents had been deported, so we were talking about what it means to grow up in a state where ethnic studies was against the law to teach in school. With that said, they were also trying to envision what a potential ID would look like in the future and what was important to highlight on that ID. The other thing, as was mentioned also, is I am one of the founding members of the Michelada think tank. We are a group of artists, organizers, educators as well, and activists who definitely create space for difficult conversations to happen surrounding originally the art field, but now has broadened up for people of color. We began doing a lot of crowdsourcing think tanks, gathering people together to have these difficult conversations, and then just also outright naming some of the issues that we're tackling, like racism within the art field, structural racism, and institutional racism as well. These are some examples of some of the think tanks that we were able to hold at LACE in Los Angeles. We were very, very honored to also be able to hold this in the midst of construction of Rafa Esparza's browning out the white cube there. And then we were also invited to Common Field to host some sessions on thinking outside of the box. This is one of the latest ones. So this is also showing out how we do crowdsourcing, and you will notice that this is what I also did during Paleta Santa Monica as well. So we invited in all the guests who were coming to San Diego Art Institute to kind of answer some of these questions about institutional and structural racism that they observed within the art field, but also whatever field that they were coming from as well. So with that said, as was also mentioned, I made sure that my team also represented people that we were trying to also talk to us. As was mentioned, most of the feedback that was gained through the online survey was your typical white, upper class people who lived within Santa Monica. And truthfully, what we wanted to hear from was also people that have to work 9-to-5 jobs, sometimes 2 jobs, so they don't have time to go to town hall meetings. There is a possibility that at home there's no access to internet, so that also leaves out a great chunk of people who are not able to answer online surveys. And we also wanted to make sure that we also got the opinion of sometimes people who work within Santa Monica, maybe over 10 to 12 hours a day as well. So they're also considered people who work and live within the area. So with that said, since we do a lot of talking down, I'd like to invite you to actually participate in just a quick activity. You don't have to talk to your neighbor. It's mainly about standing and then sitting down. So I'm gonna make a statement, and if you agree with that, go ahead and stand up. Stay standing, wait for the following statement, and if you still agree with the statement, stay standing or you can sit down. Any questions? All right. You grew up with one or more languages spoken at home. One or more languages spoken at home. All right. You regularly had books to read at home when you were growing up. You regularly heard the news on television in another language when you were growing up. You grew up in a single-family home, a single-parent home. All right, thank you for participating. This activity was mainly to also disrupt some of our assumptions and prejudice that we have when we're starting to create different projects. It's super important that when we're starting projects that we understand that if we are not from that community, we also have to decenter our own assumptions. And I think that was very important when I was going into this project, is realizing while I may have lived in the Los Angeles area and participated in events and community festivals within Santa Monica, I'm not from Santa Monica. So that was very important for me to understand and decenter my own assumptions through this process. So what I did is, I have a good friend who does work in Santa Monica and was able to help me recruit different people within the area who either work or live within Santa Monica, so they also know the streets that we were going on. I was able to assemble 2 teams, by the way. Santa Monica found it super important once they realized the importance of actually walking within the neighborhoods and actually talking face-to-face with people, how important it would be to actually have 2 teams rather than 1 to do that. And so with just the one tagline, a popsicle for your opinion, we were able to gather people's opinions walking around every Saturday in August of 2017. In addition, I made sure that there was branding for this project because it was super important that we were recognized as well. We had one test weekend where we were able to go to a community fair, and that started testing out some of the branding that I had created for this project. Each popsicle that I was able to locally source from San Diego, where I'm based out of, they were also generous enough to go ahead and print up my own labels on there. Each label contained one question from the survey I was asking. So what is public art was one of them. What is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about public art in Santa Monica was another one. These were the initial questions that we asked as team members to the people we approached, or if we were parked, because sometimes there were situations where we actually had to park, that we would ask people to begin engaging with us. Typically after that initial question and introducing us that it's a free popsicle in return for just a conversation about public art, people were more than willing to participate in the program. Of course, because there is some exchange, but also, once again, it's touching some of that feel-good feeling also of food, something sweet. There was a hot August as well, so people wanted to participate, and then we're very curious as to why I was giving away free popsicles in exchange for a conversation as well. So as you can see from these photos, we went everywhere from public parks, we went to, I think there's another slide in a bit, of farmers markets. We walked the touristy parts as well as just neighborhoods as well. We wanted to make sure we got a breadth of opinions. Surveys were also printed in English and Spanish, since English is the dominant language in Santa Monica, followed up by Spanish, but what we also found was that Mandarin, Arabic, as well as Vietnamese were also languages that were very prominent in the area. In regards to what language we decided to ask our participants, it really depended on the conversations that we had. I made sure that there was at least one person on every team who spoke Spanish, and depending on how the participant wanted to respond is how we responded in return. There were times where the participant wanted to read the survey in Spanish but answered in English. There were also times where we had a conversation in Spanish, but they felt all right writing in English as well. Depending on how the conversation went to, we either had the person themselves write in their answers, or we just conversed and made sure we hit certain questions and we would take notes on that. So it was very flexible. It was really important to stay flexible as well, because not every public is exactly the same. Here's just another example of us having fun, because once you've been out in the sun for about 5 hours, it's a little delirious. Also, our 2 carts that we had for Paleta Santa Monica. So some of our takeaways that we were able to highlight, or I was able to highlight and give to Santa Monica, was 66 of the participants actually said that that there was art that existed for them within Santa Monica. 44% actually did not. While 66% is a great number, 44% of a population is actually not that great. To know that 44%, almost half, don't feel that the art is relating to them. So that was something that was really significant to realize. What we made sure, as I also had highlighted a little bit earlier, is that we made sure that we touched on everyone, whether it was at a community festival or even at a park where usually houseless people are allowed to camp during the night. But unfortunately, as I encountered during this one day, they're also run out, especially if there's a festival that's supposed to be set up at that one time as well. So what I was able to do is at least I was able to approach some of the people who were being tossed out of the park, unfortunately, on the sides of the road. And they welcomed the exchange. And they also had lots of opinions about what art meant to them. We made it a point of hitting all 5 zip codes, and as you can see, the 1% was actually where part of the wealthiest of Santa Monica live, was ironically the place where I got the least amount of responses. Some people walked away from us, some people ignored us, or answered the survey just halfway through it and walked away as well. So it was very interesting to get that. These are the routes that we took. So as you can see from the previous slide, that we took both busy tourist, pedestrian ways, as well as busy streets that were the most frequented by people, businesses, pedestrians. There were farmers markets, there were parks and such. Another thing that we highlighted was that 29% of the people that I interviewed, or that my teams interviewed, actually knew about a public master plan or a public art master plan. 62 were unsure or actually didn't have any knowledge about it at all. 9% actually chose not to answer that question as well. So I think it was very important to understand that some of these artworks, and what I did was creating space for these conversations to happen, is that sometimes the information that we gather is actually very helpful for the city, even though it might be exactly the opposite of what they were looking for. In this slide too, what I also did was I was able to gather all of the information and all the narratives that people shared with us. And what came about is that when people thought about what art was to them in Santa Monica, the biggest things that were highlighted were the park art, murals, and street, and public. This gave, in the middle of the interviews, this gave us an idea that what people thought as public art was mainly visual, was mainly on walls, typically only 2D, and also used lots of color. So things that they also thought about as art was such a thing as the park, but ironically, that's where people are also kicked out of those places. I'll go back to the slide again, sorry. What I'd also like to highlight too was just being, if you're working with artists, is just being important to be flexible as well. I think it's important to understand that everything that we list as an artist that's gonna, on our proposal, sometimes changes in the midst of it. But luckily I worked with great people who were also able to be flexible during that journey. What that also meant was not only were we able to bring in 2 carts, so I had 2 teams, but I was also able to have stipends for each of my team members as well. So it's also important to be able to compensate the artists and team members who work within these works to be able to do a great job, because it's something that they also believe in as well. Thank you.
We're getting ready. Hi, I'm Carla Raines with Corona Insights, and we're going to use Imagine 2020, Denver's cultural plan, as a snapshot of disruption in an actual cultural planning process. So my job is to tell you the story of how we did that and give you a glimpse of the tool that we used to create the disruption and what it has meant for the city since the cultural plan was released in early 2014. All right. This process started with a very strong mandate from our mayor, Michael B. Hancock. And when I say we, I'm referring to the we of the Denver Commission on Cultural Affairs, Denver Arts and Venues, and Corona Insights as the consultant on the project. So the mayor said to us, I want you to get into the nooks and crannies of the city. I don't want to hear from just the usual suspects. I still remember being in the room when he said that, and that became a mantra for us in this process. This is a story of civic leadership, standing in the void when the process was not delivering that voice. So that's what today is all about, is sharing that with you. So when Imagine 2020 started in early 2013, of course, we were looking at the plans that other cities had created. So we were looking at Chicago. We have very ambitious folks in Denver. We were looking at London. We were looking at Austin and other plans to see what kinds of processes that they use and how can we be as robust, to the examples of my colleagues here on the bench, how can we be as robust as we can in our outreach and engagement so we can do what the mayor has asked us to do. And so we came up with a process that included a number of key audiences, kind of starting at the middle, thinking about the folks that were closest to the work, including the commission and other key volunteers, extending out through a stakeholder leadership group, makers and doers, and out to the general public of Denver. And we had, I want the popsicle truck next time. If we get to do Imagine 2030, I want the popsicle truck because I think that'd be awesome. Or I think a coffee or craft beer in Denver. And so we were out at festivals and fairs. We had a street team. We were in city council meetings. You name it, we were doing it, trying to get out into the nooks and crannies of the city. And similar to the stories of, again, our other communities in this process, by the midpoint, so this is 5 years ago, probably about this month in June of 2013, we'd heard from about 2,000 people. You know, at the time, Denver had about 500,000 residents, so that's a really great engagement number. We were really happy with that. The challenge is those people largely look like me, right? And so then that meant we had not met the mandate from the mayor to get out into the nooks and crannies of the city. And so the Denver Commission on Cultural Affairs said, you know what, that's not good enough. We've got to take a time out. We've got to hit the pause button. And it was suggested and then agreed that we would engage in a statistically valid general public survey. That if we wanted to get out and find out what Denver residents thought, we needed to get out and talk to them. And so this slide also shows, as you guys know, in cultural planning, there's tons of different moving pieces. You've got lots of meetings. You've got things you're trying to do in terms of engaging the general public. You've got your stakeholder folks you're working with. And so we were literally, we'd had our second of 2 meetings with our large stakeholder group when we realized we needed to change things up, right? This work is co-created. We've got to be natural and authentic with what's going on in our community. So that's when we decided to do our survey. Now, by the end of Imagine 2020, we heard from over 5,000 people. Again, really, really great participation and representation that was all the way through the end of the process with public input on the final plan and all that great stuff. So what I wanted to do today was tell you a little bit about our survey. Both survey reports that we did in 2013 and 2017 are up on Denver Arts and Venues website. So if you type in Imagine Denver 2020, you'll see the full cultural plan, and you'll see the survey reports that were done as the baseline. The commission felt very, very strongly that the city needed to be accountable to its residents about how we were doing in this work. And so it was very important to us that we designed a survey that was longitudinal, which means you've got to be stalwart in your question design, right? You can't be changing the questions all the time if you're going to measure and compare over time. You've got to really hold the line on that, and we did that. And we knew it was also very important that our survey sample, the number of people we heard from, was large enough to be able to do some very, very important analysis. Now, in telephone survey work today, you've got to use cell phones and landlines. There's lots of science behind the figuring all that out. I have smart people in my office, colleagues that do that. I just know how to get up here and tell you about what we learned, which is great. Now, one of the other key hallmarks of this survey is we sampled sufficient numbers of African American and Hispanic fellow residents so we could contrast and compare their experiences with everybody else. So we could look at the data both at the top line for 800 in total, and then we could actually pull out data for that comparison. That's where this survey became so important to us as a community. So I get to get creative since my slide gets cut off a little bit here. So one of the things that we felt was really important in Denver is, you know, you've got to start out with a little bit of that softball question, right? Where you want to find out, what do people really think about what's going on? And we wanted to find out the extent to which Denver residents feel that we are an arts town, right? We're an outdoorsy town, we're a sports town, used to think of ourselves as a cow town. What are folks going to say in terms of our sense of who we are? I'm proud to say we've been holding at 84% since 2013, that there really is a sense of belief in the arts here. There is, of course, very high participation in the arts in Denver, as we've heard with our other fellow cities and the NEA data, as well as the Americans for the Arts data. One of the kind of benchmark questions we ask is we ask Denver residents to let us know how important you think arts, culture, and creativity are to making a positive contribution to the civic life of the city. And we ask about 9 different measures. And what the sampling allows us to do is to find measures where we can see if a change is statistically significant, right? We know that beyond the margin of error, something has happened, right, that moves us either in a direction that says we're getting traction or maybe not. And so you can see here the sense that the arts are bringing people together and attracting cultural tourism were noted as positive changes since the 2013 findings. Now again, in all 9 measures, our support for arts, culture, and creativity in the city are off the charts, very, very high. Let me make this point to everybody too. We did not define arts, culture, or creativity. Very much in keeping with what we're seeing from Culture Track and others, let the person define it for themselves with the democratization of the arts and the sense that so much more is in that category than was in the past. Now, one of our other kind of benchmark questions was we asked Denver residents, do you participate as much as you would like? Okay. So you start out with that, I do not participate as much as I want, or I do. Now this is looking at the aggregate data, right, 800 folks. So the good news is fewer people were saying they didn't participate as much as they wanted, right, which is awesome, right? And you've got 1% more are saying they're going to way too much stuff, right? They've got the 3% are saying that they're participating more than they want. They're probably the folks we know that are going to every event in town. Now, this is where the ability to slice and dice the data gets to be really important. So the blue bar represents our African American fellow residents in Denver. The kind of red bar are our Latino residents, and the gray bar is everyone else. Okay? So you can see there's quite a notable difference in terms of whether or not people are participating as much as they want, right? So again, this really has served as a call to action for our community, because it tells us that we need to figure out how to make the arts more accessible to Denver residents, and that people might have varying levels of access depending on where they live, what's available to them, and the kinds of barriers they might be facing. One of the other questions we asked is, are you satisfied with the amount of arts, culture, and creativity that are available in the city? And are you satisfied with the amount that's in your neighborhood? So again, we can see orange is poor to fair. Green is good to very good. So again, you can see a notable difference in response based on this analysis. So again, and the thing that's always important to remember with survey research is surveys will tell you what, but they won't tell you why, right? So digging deeper into this to get to the why is a really important piece. Now, we know we've asked questions about barriers to participation. These are a lot of the classic ones that we see across the country. In Denver, of course, parking is getting to be a big deal, and just worry about parking is a big deal, as well as we have so much going on in the community that it's almost hard to know what to pick. So we have those kinds of barriers. We have issues around, is there anybody to go with? We've got issues around cost and those sorts of things. So as we think about Imagine 2020, it really holds forth a 7-part vision that was very intentionally written to describe kind of the city of our dreams, right? And when we laid this out in 2013, we said, well, 2020 is only 7 years from now. That was a very intentional choice versus going out to 10 years. And let's see what we can make happen within that time frame. And you can see in terms of the vision elements that are here, number 1, integration, and number 3, accessibility. 1 is really the idea, and it's come up today so many times in conversations, the idea of integrating arts, culture, and creativity into daily life, that it's unavoidable, right? It's everywhere you look and you turn, there's something for you to engage in. So when we think about integration and when we think about accessibility, what this data tells us is we have more work to do, right? We have continued work to do as a community here. One of the things that the city has been doing since Imagine 2020 was launched is embarking on efforts like the PSU Are Here grant program, the Imagine 2020 grant program, the Imagine 2020 speaker series, where we're making data like this available to all of our arts and cultural partners around the city so that it's great for the city to know that more needs to be done. But what really needs to happen is we need our partners in arts, cultural, and scientific organizations around the community, large to small, engaging in this work with us. So as we think out to the future of Imagine 2020, we can, and thinking beyond Imagine 2020, we can think about, well, what can this data do for us as we think about moving forward? So assuming that we do our final survey for Imagine 2020 in 2020, then that would then really be the baseline, right, for Imagine 2030 or Imagine 2040 or whatever the next iteration is. And we'll have so much more information available than we did in 2013 about what Denver residents are really thinking. We'll be able to explore more to the why, and I think get into some of the other disruptive tools that my colleagues mentioned earlier. So this was one of our big questions when we started Imagine 2020. What if we were audacious? And I think we'll ask ourselves that question again. Thank you.
So, questions, comments, reactions? Jeff will bring you the microphone.
Really? Okay.
Hi. I live in Venice, California, which is just adjacent to Santa Monica. And Santa Monica is known as a kind of a upper income community in many ways. So my question to you is, How did you decide, or was there any consideration of the level of income in terms of your assessment of your feedback? And how did you decide, doesn't matter, either one of you, how did you decide which populations you wanted to focus on? And the reason I say that is that it has a huge swelling daytime population, but a lot of people can't afford to live there. So it sounds like I kind of intimated that you interviewed a lot of people who worked there but couldn't afford to live there. Mm-hmm. So what was there any emphasis? How did you decide how to balance, if there was a balance, et cetera?
Okay, I'm going to answer the question, and then I also want to say one other thing. We did not ask income on the online survey or as part of Mario's survey. One of the things that it's true, Santa Monica is very expensive to live in, and it really swells during the week, and that was part of the reason why we asked Mario to come on the weekends. Because the interesting thing about Santa Monica that I didn't know until we started working on this project is that it's actually 30% property owner, 70% renter. And what we found was that the renter population was really a big part of the population that we weren't getting to, and that's one of the reasons why Mario went out. We asked him to sort of drive around the city, see what the city culture was. He worked with local people, but figure out exactly where people congregated that he could get to. The other thing I wanted to say that I think we missed in our presentation is that, originally we had a certain line item budget for Mario and his involvement, and the city doubled that. And the reason why the city doubled that is because I think they realized that once the proposal came in and they wanted to fund a second team, that would actually allow them to have a greater outreach. And so Mario coordinated 2 teams instead of 1. And I want to emphasize that when we talk about collaboration with a bunch of entities, that oftentimes, the cities really need to think about what is the result of what it is that they're trying to do. And sometimes it is better to add more money to the budget. They add a lot of resources. Laura Becker, I'm going to acknowledge Laura. Laura was the staff person at that time. She really helped us coordinate with all the various city departments. So great question, Rochelle. Thanks for asking. Mario, did you want to answer anything to that?
Sure. What I've also found in a lot of the work that I also do too is that if that question is asked, it actually creates a barrier right off the bat for people to answer honestly. And I wanted to make sure that I captured people's opinions honestly regarding what the city of Santa Monica was wanting to know about public art. One of the questions that wasn't necessarily on the online questionnaire really was my opening question. If people thought that there existed art that they could relate to, I think we had it phrased a little bit differently, mm-hmm. And there was some worry that people would get confused. But at the same time, I didn't want to, I think we've also touched base on this too, is I didn't want to define that. I wanted the people to define it for themselves as to what they thought public art was. So those were 2 important things that one, I omitted purposely, and 2, that I left nebulous.
Maybe you already discussed it, but was there an age limit to the popsicles for opinions?
There was actually not age limit, and one slide I actually accidentally deleted from this was a couple kids actually drawing on a survey. I had created 2 surveys, so if kids wanted to answer it, we had asked kids to actually draw what kind of art that they had wanted to see in their city. A lot of actually students drew art, typically murals, that they had been part of different projects within the school systems. And of course, that was still in exchange for a popsicle as well.
Yeah, I also want to say one of the things that was so great about Mario's project, because I went out with them a little bit during the times that they were there on the weekend, is how many families engaged. And a lot of times there were surveys where the parent was reading the questions to the kid, and the kid was eating the popsicle, and they were answering the questions together. And so it was very much a sort of like family-oriented communal thing to participate in, which I think was really successful for the project.
Hi, my name is Cynthia, and I'm from the city. I work for the city of Chula Vista in California, and I was just wondering if you guys ever considered to do this in another city, to do it again. And
You'd have to hire this guy. I just told him when she was presenting that you better trademark this.
I was actually invited back by the city of Santa Monica in October to go ahead and do a smaller run. It was also just gathering opinions on their Day of the Dead celebration on what they thought. They wanted to know what the public thought that they could do better. And so they asked me to somehow not recreate the survey, but create a new survey that would involve similar aspects of it. So I did that in October. And if I would do it again, yeah, I would definitely do it again.
Chula Vista is not far from San Diego.
All right, just about one more question and then final thoughts.
First of all, thank you all so much for sharing. I have a question. I love the popsicle and walking around idea, but I also recognize that not every city or town has the budget for that. So what are some strategies any of the panelists would have to make sure you're including the full community, especially if the city or town does not have the budget to pay people to walk around?
Well, I want to say that I think it's very important for cities to pay artists. I don't think it's appropriate for cities to ask for artists to volunteer their time. I think as an arts professional, I feel like, artists get a lot of, they often get asked to donate work or their time or their energy, and usually they're doing it anyway. So my own personal opinion about it is that I never ask an artist to do something for free. Aside from that, one thing that I do want to point out is that the project that was in Joshua Tree was a relatively low budget. The zine was $2,000 for him to do the illustrations and participate. And then we have 2 temporary art projects that are going up that Joanna Lopez, one of her works was actually in the year of review from the pre-conference. And that budget was $3,200. So I feel like, cities and entities find money for other things. They sort of need to find money for artists to be included in that process. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I was going to say, am I on? I was going to say too, what we're talking about really are different forms of intercept surveys, right? And I think what we found in the Denver process was we, for example, had city council hosted meetings, not the best turnout, right? Hate to say it. And so I think now we know we've got to go to where people are. And so there needs to be some investment of time, right, to go to where people are and then engage with them in a way that's authentic. So it may be that you hear from fewer people, but I think it also kind of physically and emotionally demonstrates that commitment.
Just to add, that one finding from the research that I shared, about 80% of the people who responded to the survey felt that the process was really important in how successful the plan was. And I was really, somewhat surprised that it was such a high percentage. But I think that's really an indication that cities and those who are commissioning cultural plans do value process. I appreciate that some communities really don't have a lot of money, and I've worked on some low-budget projects, and sometimes I've paid artists out of my fee to do some things in community. It is really tough, but one of the things, and Libby Maynard taught me this, you have to make things fun. If you can, any kind of community activities, a civic meeting, anything you're doing, and artists are really helpful at that. But if you can find some way to make it fun and have food, maybe music, it draws more people and they feel better about it, and they're going to come back again to participate in civic activities because they had a good time and they met new people and that sort of thing. So it is really tough when budgets are really tight for communities, but we just have to do the best we can to squeeze a little bit of creative activity into everything we do.
Mm-hmm.
Just going to rise. First of all, I think a second thing besides fun that Mario demonstrated is that artists ask good questions, and they figure out ways to ask questions that go around the norm. I just want to alert folks, at our policy, at our pre-conference around equity, we had Axel Santana from Policy Link. And Policy Link, I think, anticipating this conversation about disruption, has been preparing a tool, an online tool, that looks at planning for equity. And it's something that is going to be an online tool that gets at equity, planning for equity in cultural planning, and doing equity planning and assessment as a prelude to cultural planning. And it's talking about some elements, and it's just a good way to begin to structure your thinking about how to do the work before you do the work, essentially, so that you're doing good work. So look for it. It's not public yet, but it's coming out. They'll be announcing it, and Americans for the Arts will be.
Thank you, everyone. It's right at 4:15. Are we, Jeff, where did you go? Are we allowed to? We have to wrap it up? Thank you, and thank you all.